On the morning of February 24, 1986, the sun rose over Van Nuys, California, just like any other day. The streets bustled with commuters, children rushed to school, and inside a condominium nestled on Balboa Boulevard, silence lingered in a place where laughter once echoed. Sherri Rasmussen, a 29-year-old critical care nurse and newlywed, lay brutally murdered on her bedroom floor. Her face was battered, her lips swollen, her body cold. Blood soaked through her robe, trailing across the carpet like a scream frozen in time. Sherri's father, Nels Rasmussen, had sensed something was wrong the moment he heard she hadn't shown up for work. His daughter was never late, never absent without a call. She was the kind of woman who showed up early and stayed late, especially in her position as director of critical care at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. When her husband, John Ruetten, called Sherri's parents that evening to say she hadn't come home, Nels told him this wasn't a missed appointment. Something far darker had happened. The Van Nuys division of the LAPT responded to the call for a welfare check around 6 p.m. John had returned from work to find their condo door ajar, shards of broken glass near the sliding door in the living room, and his wife's lifeless body sprawled in the bedroom. There were signs of a struggle, furniture overturned, a bloody smudge on the wall, and a VCR missing from the shelf. To detectives, it looked like a botched burglary gone wrong. But Nels Rasmussen saw through it instantly. His daughter was strong. She was trained in emergency response and had diffused volatile patients. He knew Sherri wouldn't have gone down without a fight. Her face had been savagely beaten, her lips split wide, and she'd been shot 3 times at close range. Nels was convinced it was personal. And he had one name on his mind, Stephanie Lazarus. Stephanie was not just a former flame of John Ruetten's. She was also a Los Angeles Police Department officer. A woman who, according to what Sherri had told her family, simply refused to let go of her past relationship with John, even after he'd become engaged to Sherri. In the months leading up to the murder, Sherri had confided in her father and friends that a woman, a cop, she said, was harassing her. Sherri told stories of how this woman had shown up at her work, warned her to leave John alone, and even appeared at their condo uninvited. When Nels mentioned Stephanie Lazarus by name to the detectives, they brushed it off. LAPT didn't look into one of their own. Instead, they clung to the burglary theory. After all, there had been a smashed sliding door and missing electronics. But some things didn't add up. Jewelry boxes lay untouched, Sherri's purse was still in the kitchen, and most damning of all, the so-called burglars had somehow entered and exited through a second-story window in broad daylight without alerting any neighbors. The original detectives on the case even suggested that Sherri may have startled the burglars and been killed in the scuffle. It was a simple explanation. Convenient, even. But it ignored key facts, like the 2 bite marks found on Sherri's arm. At the time, DNA testing wasn't what it is today, so the bite marks were swabbed and catalogued, but they were never pursued further. The case stalled. Meanwhile, Stephanie Lazarus continued her career with the LAPT, rising through the ranks and eventually joining the elite art theft detail. She appeared in department newsletters, gave interviews, and remained an officer in good standing. No one within the department knew, or perhaps wanted to know, that she had ever been a suspect, even an unofficial one, in a brutal homicide. But Nels Rasmussen never let it go. For over 2 decades, he wrote letters to the LAPT, prosecutors, even state officials, pleading for someone to re-examine his daughter's murder. He reminded them of the threats Sherri had endured and the clear warning signs they had ignored. He didn't have police training, but he had something stronger, a father's determination. And he never forgot that Sherri had been afraid. By the late 1990s, Sherri's case had grown cold. The burglary narrative had all but fossilized in the LAPT archives. And yet, in 2001, the department began digitizing old case files, and evidence from decades past began to resurface. Among them was the DNA swab taken from the bite mark on Sherri's arm. Stored in a test tube and nearly forgotten, it held a secret that would finally crack the case open, but not just yet. The truth was still buried, not by time, but by silence. And Stephanie Lazarus? She had no idea her past was about to rise like a ghost from the files. For years, the murder of Sherri Rasmussen haunted the people who loved her. Her father, Nels, remained a lone voice in a sea of apathy, insisting over and over that the burglary story was a lie. But LAPT held its line. Case closed. Or rather, left to collect dust. Stephanie Lazarus had moved on. Outwardly, she was everything an officer should be: disciplined, intelligent, and respected. She taught youth programs, trained recruits, and worked high-profile cases with the art theft unit. Her smile appeared in department newsletters. She got married, adopted a daughter, and bought a home in Simi Valley. By all appearances, she was living the dream she always wanted, married to a fellow officer, respected by peers, and far from any suspicion. But something always lingered beneath the surface. In the months after Sherri's murder, co-workers recalled Stephanie being unusually emotional, crying at work without clear reason. One friend said she confessed that she'd been in John Ruetten's life recently and couldn't accept how things ended. Another officer remembered that she mentioned showing up at John and Sherri's condo, just to see it. None of these anecdotes triggered alarm at the time. After all, a bad breakup can cause lingering emotions. What no one considered was that Lazarus may have acted on those emotions, with deadly intent. Fast forward to 2004. Inside the Lapt, a cold case unit had been formed to re-examine unsolved murders, particularly those with biological evidence preserved from before the DNA boom. One day, a detective named Jim Nuttall pulled the Rasmussen file from the archives. Something about the case, the brutality, the inconsistencies, the personal nature of the violence, caught his eye. He began digging. Among the evidence was a sealed test tube, inside it, a cotton swab from the bite mark on Sherri's arm. The wound had always stood out to Nels Rasmussen, who believed it pointed to rage, rather than opportunism. It suggested the killer had attacked Sherri in a frenzy. Nuttall submitted the sample for DNA analysis. The results changed everything. The profile was female. That one fact instantly unraveled the original theory that two male burglars had murdered Sherri. It also narrowed the suspect list to a far more intimate circle. Nuttall went back to the case notes, what little there were, and found no mention of any female suspect ever being considered. But then he saw a handwritten note in the margins of an early report, John's ex, female, Lapt. That was all he needed. Quietly, the cold case team began looking into Stephanie Lazarus. But investigating a cop, especially one still active in the department, required meticulous planning and absolute discretion. If Stephanie got wind that she was being watched, any chance at catching her off guard would vanish. And so the team kept the circle tight. They traced Stephanie's history with John Ruetten. The two had met at UCLA in the early 1980s and had dated on and off for years. Stephanie, according to John, had always wanted something more serious, but he hadn't felt the same. Still, he admitted to sleeping with her even after he started seeing Sherri, a decision he would later regret deeply. John described Stephanie as possessive and emotional. He told the cold case detectives that even after his engagement to Sherri, Stephanie had tried to remain in his life. She had shown up at his condo unannounced, once brought him cookies, and even stayed overnight in the guest room after his engagement, claiming she needed someone to talk to. Meanwhile, detectives obtained a discarded object from Stephanie, an empty coffee cup thrown away at work. It was legal, covert, and decisive. The DNA on the cup matched the profile from the bite mark on Sherri's body. The killer had been inside the Lapt all along. But how do you arrest a fellow cop? Especially one trained in tactics, weapons, and interrogation? The team hatched a plan. They needed to question Stephanie without raising suspicion, somewhere with controlled access and minimal risk. They lured her to a secure interview room under the guise of asking her about an old case from her art theft division. She walked in casually, unsuspecting, confident. But as the conversation shifted to Sherri Rasmussen, Stephanie's demeanor changed. She began fidgeting, deflecting, and at one point, claimed she barely remembered Sherri. But the inconsistencies piled up. She admitted to knowing John was engaged, then later denied knowing who he was dating at the time. When asked directly if she'd ever been to John's condo after his engagement, she dodged the question. Her answers contradicted her own previous statements. She even laughed nervously, saying, "You think I had something to do with her death," before asking for a lawyer. She never left the building. Stephanie Lazarus was arrested and charged with the murder of Sherri Rasmussen, 23 years after the crime. The once celebrated Lapt officer now faced life in prison. Her arrest sent shockwaves through the department. Many officers who had worked alongside her refused to believe it. But the DNA evidence was irrefutable. Moreover, the circumstances of the crime, Sherri being beaten, bitten, and then shot execution style, painted a picture of jealousy turned homicidal. Prosecutors believed Stephanie had used her off-duty hours and departmental training to plan and execute the murder. She brought her service weapon, staged the scene to look like a burglary, and used a blanket to muffle the gunshots. She even took the VCR to make the scene appear like a robbery, but left valuable items untouched. It was personal, not opportunistic. The case exposed cracks not only in Stephanie's carefully constructed persona, but in the Lapt itself. How had no one followed up on the original warnings from Nels Rasmussen? Why had the department failed to question one of their own when the victim's father named her outright? Had Sherri's case been intentionally buried to protect the thin blue line? When the trial finally approached, Stephanie pleaded not guilty. Her defense team argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that her DNA could have ended up on Sherri from an innocent prior encounter. But the prosecution had over 2 decades of motive, opportunity, and finally, hard science. The trial of Stephanie Lazarus began on February 6, 2012, in a packed Los Angeles courtroom. After more than 2 decades of silence, Sherri Rasmussen's murder would finally be brought into the light. What made the case extraordinary wasn't only the violence of the crime, but the person on trial, an lap detective accused of killing her ex-boyfriend's wife in cold blood, then resuming a normal life inside the very force tasked with finding the killer. Prosecutors painted a devastating portrait. They described a crime of passion meticulously executed by a woman trained in deception, surveillance, and weapons. Stephanie Lazarus, they argued, wasn't just heartbroken. She was enraged, humiliated by rejection and driven to eliminate the woman who stood between her and the man she had never stopped obsessing over. Sherri had been bludgeoned in the face with such force that her teeth shattered. She was bitten in the forearm with enough aggression to leave behind a clear, angry imprint, one that, decades later, gave her a voice through DNA. And she was shot 3 times in the chest, 2 bullets fired through a quilt to suppress the sound. The staging of the crime scene was clumsy. The VCR and stereo equipment taken were typical decoys, while the true motive lay in the brutality itself. John Ruetten took the stand and testified with visible torment. He recalled his relationship with Stephanie and admitted to sexual encounters with her even after dating Sherri. He described how she struggled to accept the end of their relationship and had appeared uninvited at his condo on more than one occasion. She would cry. She would say it wasn't fair. She still loved me, John told the court. But he had moved on, he said. Sherri was his future. Stephanie belonged to a past that couldn't let go. Defense attorneys attempted to push back. They claimed the evidence was circumstantial. No fingerprints, no eyewitnesses. They pointed out that the lab had lost the original case files for a time and hinted that someone could have planted the DNA. They even floated the idea that the bite mark DNA might have transferred from an innocent interaction, something prosecutors dismantled immediately. The bite, they explained, was on a deep defensive wound. It wasn't transferred from a handshake or borrowed towel. It was deliberate, violent, rage-filled. A forensic odontologist confirmed it matched the upper dental pattern of Lazarus. Coupled with the DNA match from the coffee cup Lazarus had unknowingly discarded, the science was damning. Prosecutors reminded the jury that Lazarus had access to evidence lockers and crime scenes, that she knew how investigations worked, and that she had years to quietly remove anything that could incriminate her. Her entire career, they argued, had been one long act of concealment. Stephanie remained composed in court. Gone were the confident smiles of her police newsletter days. In their place, silence and stillness. Her husband and daughter sat behind her in stunned disbelief. But to the Rasmussen family, it was never about whether she looked guilty, it was about who Sherri had been and what she had suffered. Sherri Rasmussen was 29 years old when her life ended. A skilled nurse, a daughter, a sister, a wife. She had dreams of opening a clinic, helping underprivileged women, starting a family. Instead, she was buried with her wedding ring still on her finger and bruises still visible beneath the casket makeup. Nels Rasmussen, now in his 80s, took the stand and spoke not only of his grief but of the stonewalling he endured from law enforcement. He had told detectives in 1986 about Stephanie. He had warned them. And they had ignored him. They told me I watched too much TV, he said, his voice shaking with both age and fury. But I knew who did it. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On March 8, 2012, they returned with a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. Stephanie Lazarus was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. At her sentencing, she maintained her innocence. She offered no apology. She showed no emotion. Sherri's family, however, finally had a form of justice, delayed, but not denied. The case sent ripples through the lap and beyond. Internal reviews were launched. How had Stephanie Lazarus, one of their own, evaded scrutiny for so long? Were blind loyalties and departmental pride prioritized over the truth? It turned out the answer was yes. In the original investigation, Sherri's body was barely cold before detectives had settled on a burglary gone wrong. Despite clear indications of personal rage, the bite mark, the focused violence, the lack of sexual assault, they chose convenience over complexity. When Nels Rasmussen told them about the woman John had dated, a cop no less, it wasn't written into official reports. Her name wasn't logged. No interviews were recorded. It was almost as if she had never existed. That omission wasn't just lazy. It was negligent. Sherri's killer wasn't just a jealous ex. She was a trained officer who knew how to eliminate evidence and manipulate crime scenes, and the Lapt had let her walk back into their ranks as a detective. Stephanie's conviction was more than the fall of a rogue officer. It was a moment of reckoning for an entire system. In prison, Lazarus lives a quiet life behind bars. Inmate records show no major infractions. She teaches Bible study and keeps to herself. But outside those walls, her name will forever be linked not to the cases she solved, but to the one she committed. Sherri's murder left a scar not only on her family but on an entire community. It challenged faith in justice, loyalty, and the institutions sworn to protect us. Yet, in the end, science, and a father's refusal to give up, won. Today, Sherri's face is remembered not just as a victim, but as a symbol of perseverance. Her story reminds us that the truth can be buried, but not forever. That even behind a badge, evil can hide. And that sometimes, it takes decades to speak for the silenced. But when that voice returns, it demands to be heard. Thank you for listening to Crime Echoes with Lewis. For more content like this, please like this video and subscribe to my channel.